service funded by the nation's cable companies. Coming up, a look at Saudi.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. 9:30. The Judiciary Committee will now proceed with this hearing on the issue of Saudi Arabia and the efforts by Saudi Arabia, or to what extent Saudi Arabia is making efforts to combat terrorism with respect to the dissemination of information and propaganda to Saudis, school children, and people within the area of their influence. On July 25th, Mr. Adel Al-Jubeir came to see me to discuss the Saudi Accountability Act, which I had introduced, with some 12 co-sponsors, calling on the Saudis to implement their efforts to fight terrorism and to take active stands to stop the dissemination of anti-American, anti-Semitic, anti-Christian literature. And as a result of that meeting and certain representations made by Mr. Al-Jubeir, the hearing was scheduled by this committee for October 25th and was postponed because of the imminence of hearings on Ms. Harriet Miers for the Supreme Court of the United States. Those hearings had been scheduled to start yesterday, and with a little time, in collaboration with the scheduling by the ranking member, we have put this item on our agenda. The seriousness of the issue of terrorism is one which need not be expounded upon at any time. Our relations with Saudi Arabia, the United States' relations with Saudi Arabia, are obviously of great importance to both countries for many, many reasons. But it is critical that we confront squarely the issues of the fight against terrorism and confront squarely the problems created by the dissemination of anti-U.S., anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, anti-Western propaganda, which is disseminated with the consent and apparent promotion of the Saudi government. My concerns go back to Khobar Tower and beyond. In the 104th Congress, I chaired the Intelligence Committee and made a trip to Saudi Arabia to witness what had happened at Khobar Towers, talk to the Crown Prince, now the King of Saudi Arabia, and expressed concern about the refusal of the Saudis at that time to permit FBI agents investigating the terrorism which led to the death of 19 Americans and the wounding of hundreds, and the Saudis declined to permit the United States to conduct that investigation. There have been recurrent issues, and the one which we are looking at today, we believe, is to be one of really very great importance. I'm almost 2 minutes, with only 2 minutes left. I'm going to yield at this point to my distinguished ranking member, Senator Leahy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I may not be quite as brief, but I do believe these are extremely important hearings. You know, as a nation, we cannot defeat al-Qaeda or Islamic extremists without the assistance of all our allies in the Middle East. And we do recall, most of us do recall, that the Saudis were less than cooperative when the FBI sought to interview Saudi nationals following the Khobar Towers bombing, which you referred to. The attacks of September 11, 2001 further strained our relationships with Saudi Arabia, and they raised some very troubling questions about the Saudi government's commitment to fighting terrorism. Now, there's been some progress, but I believe there's still considerable room for improvement in the Saudi government's counterterrorism efforts. The 9/11 Commission noted in its final report that the problems in the U.S.-Saudi relationship must be confronted openly. But we've done little to openly confront the problems in that relationship. Critical information about the role of the government of Saudi Arabia before and after September 11th, and its level of cooperation with U.S. law enforcement agencies before and after has been not revealed to the public. Democratic and Republican senators have asked for it. The administration has denied the public its right to know these crucial facts. Even the former ambassador from Saudi Arabia to the U.S. asked they be declassified. And I must say, Mr. Glaser, I think the administration refuses to confront the Saudi government's role in promoting Islamic extremism. Particularly troubling has been the Saudi government's lavish funding of religious schools or madrasas throughout the region. They propagate extreme forms of Islam and advocate hatred and violence. They're threatening the existence of more moderate beliefs and practices in the Muslim world. They foster anti-Western, anti-Semitic sentiments. But more troubling is the strong link between madrasas and terrorist financing. It is widely known that the Saudi government has permitted and even encouraged fundraising by charitable Islamic groups and foundations that have been linked to known terrorist organizations. Even though they've announced restrictions to private charity organizations and relief groups sending funds overseas, the strict regulation of these restrictions remains to be seen. The President condemns many of the repressive policies of Arab nations. I agree with him, but he seems to have a blind spot when it comes to Saudi Arabia. Last month he said, quote, "The United States makes no distinction between those who commit acts of terror and those who support and harbor them because they're equally guilty of murder," close quote. Strong rhetoric. But then President Bush and Secretary Rumsfeld praised Saudi Arabia, a monarchy that has done more to promote Islamic extremism and discourage the emergence of moderate Muslim leaders than any other nation. The President defends Saudi Arabia's record in civil liberties and religious freedom, saying earlier this year that, quote, "The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia recognizes the principle of freedom upon which the United States was founded, including the freedoms enshrined under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution." That is so outrageously off the mark that at first when I saw that, I thought somebody had rewritten something, one of the things we might see on a satirical website. After all, the State Department has designated Saudi Arabia as a country of particular concern for its violations of religious freedoms. To suggest they follow the principles that founded this country, especially our First Amendment, is not only laughable, it's discouraging that anybody in government, not the least of which the President, would say that. In the 2004 country report on human rights practices, the State Department wrote that in Saudi Arabia, citizens do not have the right to change their government. The government reportedly infringed on individuals' privacy right. They may recognize the freedom enshrined in our First Amendment, but they don't allow their citizens to enjoy it. Now, I might say it's important to understand the extremist ideology promoted in the kind of publications we're going to talk about and broadcast does not reflect the teachings of Islam or the beliefs of the vast majority of Muslims. Fortunately, it's a distortion of the teachings of Islam. It's also noteworthy to mention the broadcast of extremist ideology is not limited to Muslim faith or Saudi television. Several of America's best-known Christian evangelists have made deplorable statements about Islam. These people are seen as speaking for the President and the Vice President. The Reverend Franklin Graham, who gave the invocation at George W. Bush's inauguration, said at NBC News, "We're not attacking Islam, but Islam has attacked us. I believe Islam is a very evil and wicked religion." Now that is extremely offensive to those Muslims who practice their religion with the best tenets of it. The Reverend Jerry Falwell called the Prophet Muhammad a terrorist. The Reverend Pat Robertson has likened those who practice Islam, including a very large number of very loyal Americans, as our enemy. Just as the majority of Christians or Jews reject these statements, the majority of Muslims reject the publications and broadcasts that we discussed here. So I commend the chairman for his efforts to openly address the role of Saudi Arabia in our efforts to fight terrorism. I think is an extremely important hearing, and I apologize for going almost a minute over.
Thank you very much, Senator Leahy. We had expected to have a witness from the State Department when this hearing was scheduled originally for October 25th. We had a State Department witness, and we were notified late yesterday afternoon that the State Department would not be sending a witness. It is anticipated that the Secretary of State will be visiting Saudi Arabia soon, and the indications are that the State Department thought from their point of view it was not advisable to have testimony presented at this Senate hearing. I regret that that decision was made. I believe that it is very important to shed light on these important subjects. The Syrian Accountability Act has become law. Many features similar to the Saudi Accountability Act, and the Syrian Accountability Act drew co-sponsors slowly, but is an important piece of legislation. And it is the Saudi Accountability Act which has attracted the attention and concern of the Saudi government, and I think that is a very healthy thing. And I think it is important to be very candid with our friends, the Saudis. If we're to maintain a good relationship, it ought to be in a context where we both speak frankly about what the facts are. I do appreciate, the committee does appreciate the Treasury Department sending Mr. Daniel Glaser here today. He is the Treasury Department's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes, and is the primary Treasury official for the development and coordination of international anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing policy. A bachelor's degree from Michigan, a law degree from Columbia, very distinguished record in public service. Mr. Glaser, thank you for your appearance here today, and we look forward to your testimony.
Got it. Chairman Specter, Ranking Member Leahy, and other distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today before you on the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This is an important topic that touches at the very heart of our efforts as a government to combat terrorism throughout the world. We have learned over the last 4 years, that the war on terror requires the collective efforts of every country working to combat terrorism both within its own borders and in every corner of the globe. In this collective fight, we depend on the wisdom, vigilance, and support of both our allies and those whom we traditionally hold at arm's length. Saudi Arabia is, by all measures, one of the countries most central to our global counterterrorism efforts. I would characterize the quality of this relationship as one of active partnership. The successes of global anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing efforts relies, in good measure, on ensuring that this partnership is real, focused, and lasting. Today, Saudi Arabia is actively countering the threat of terrorism. This is a key success unfortunately catalyzed in the May 2003 terrorist attacks in Riyadh, which alerted the kingdom that terrorism is not a theoretical global problem, but very much a local one. Having now suffered multiple attacks within the kingdom itself, Saudi Arabia has come to understand the clear and present danger that terrorism and its vast support structures pose to its citizens and the very fabric of everyday life. The United States experienced the same shock on September 11, 2001, and the difficult months and years that have followed. The time has now come for Saudi Arabia to take an active leadership role in all aspects of the war on terrorism. Saudi Arabia is aggressively tackling the scourge of extremism and terrorism it faces within its kingdom, but those efforts must now translate into action against the broader range of terrorist support activities wherever they are found. In some respects, Saudi Arabia has gone further than many countries in its region to build serious systems aimed at combating illicit finance. For example, recently Saudi Arabia has taken measures such as enhancing measures to target cash couriers, establishing a stringent financial regulatory regime regarding charities, developing a financial intelligence unit. Anecdotal information suggests that these measures have made it more difficult for sponsors of terrorism to fund their causes. We also must acknowledge the extraordinary effort of Saudi Arabia's internal security forces, which have been waging an ongoing battle on the ground with al-Qaeda and have themselves sustained casualties. Any assessment of Saudi Arabia's efforts should be understood against that backdrop. While we support and welcome these efforts, resolute leadership against all aspects of terrorist financing is absolutely crucial, and Saudi Arabia needs to take its efforts in this area to the next level. For example, abuse of certain charities and NGOs has been an ongoing concern. Saudi Arabia has taken impressive steps with respect to the oversight of its charitable sector as a whole. It is not clear to us, though, that these restrictions are having true effect on the global operations of certain Saudi-based international NGOs, such as the International Islamic Relief Organization, the World Assembly of Muslim Youth, and the Muslim World League. Saudi officials must concern themselves beyond the limits of restrictions within the kingdom. They must recognize that organizations so closely associated with Saudi Arabia anywhere in the world are de facto Saudi responsibility. These organizations must become an integral part of Saudi focus and policy. I'm not suggesting that Saudi Arabia go it alone. This type of comprehensive strategy will require the coordination of many regional and global counterparts, but Saudi Arabia itself must be actively engaged in ensuring that these organizations are responsive to Saudi oversight. The Saudis must care not only what happens in IRO Riyadh, but must also be concerned with what transpires in every other IRO office around the world. Moreover, formal NGOs are not the only mechanism for raising and transmitting funds to terrorists. Beyond charities, we are concerned about the pocketbooks of private donors who are not currently scrutinized by these stringent regulations. We have raised this issue on numerous occasions with our Saudi counterparts. Especially as charities and NGOs are held under closer scrutiny, it will become increasingly important to focus on the ways in which private giving has and is being abused. Finally, the fight against terrorist financing cannot be limited to al-Qaeda funding alone. Just as Saudi Arabia is working to ensure that Saudi funds do not support al-Qaeda, they must work equally diligently to thwart the funding of Palestinian terrorist groups that undermine peace and stability in the Middle East. Leadership requires a comprehensive, proactive, and zero-tolerant approach to terrorism that includes widespread vigilance over global charities and wealthy private donors, as well as a total intolerance for support to all terrorist organizations. We hope that Saudi Arabia accepts this challenge of leadership and the greater responsibilities that come along with it. As Saudi Arabia does so, we will be able to say that we have entered into a new stage of our partnership in the war against terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glaser. We've been joined by Senator Kyle. Senator Kyle, would you care to make an opening statement?
Mr. Chairman, no, I think it's more important for us to hear from the witnesses other to thank you for holding this hearing. It's just critical, and it does follow up on some hearings we've had in the Terrorism Subcommittee, which early on pointed out the fact that the great bulk of funding for terrorism was coming out of Saudi Arabia. In fact, David Althauser, then the General Counsel of the Department of Treasury, testified in this room before our subcommittee that Saudi Arabia was the epicenter of funding for terrorism. And I don't believe that that circumstance has been significantly altered. So it's important that you hold this hearing, and I thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Senator Kyle. You've been a leader in this field for a long time. My recollection is we served on the Intelligence Committee together back in the 104th Congress and have been engaged in these issues, and you chaired the subcommittee for the Judiciary Committee and have done excellent leadership work. Mr. Glaser, we're going to show a video which reflects the monitoring by the Middle East Media Research Institute on Saudi television channels. And it will depict leading Saudi religious figures, professors, government leaders, and intellectuals this year and last year, where they call for the annihilation of Christians and Jews, rampant anti-American and anti-Semitism, support for jihad, incitement against U.S. troops in Iraq, and the coming Islamic conquest of the United States. Very, very graphic evidence as to a very intense problem. On May 23rd of this year, just a few months ago, the Undersecretary for the Department of the Treasury, Stuart Levy, made this statement, quote, "In addition to the export of terrorist funds, we are extremely concerned about the export of terror ideologies. These teachings are as indispensable to terrorists as money and possibly even more dangerous. We must do all we can to ensure that extremist violent ideologies are not disseminated under the cover of religious organizations, charities, or school. The September 2005 GAO report says that Treasury, quote, does not identify, monitor, or counter the support and funding of the global propagation of Islamic extremism as it relates to ideology. Question is, in light of the explicit Treasury Department policy as articulated by the Undersecretary, how do you account for the fact that GAO reports that the Treasury Department has done nothing to formalize a program to counter this propaganda?
Thank you, Senator. I think that the reference in the GAO report that you're referring to is a very legalistic point that it's making, saying that the specific authorities that we have at the Treasury Department to target terrorism, in particular our Executive Order 13224, which gives us the authority to impose targeted financial sanctions on supporters of terrorism, focuses on the activities of individuals. It doesn't focus on the ideology of an individual. And I think that's the point that the GAO is trying to make in that. Of course, we can use this authority, though, to undermine the underlying support networks that do promote the propagation of extremist ideology, and we have done so. The GAO report mentions our targeting of Al-Haramain Foundation. We have targeted with our authorities Al-Faqih. Last year, we designated him. The websites that he and his organization were running were propagating extremist ideology. So I think it's important to understand that quote in the GAO report is speaking to the legal foundation upon which we operate, not to the overall policies that we have at the Treasury Department. Certainly at the Treasury Department, we're very concerned about the propagation of extremist ideology and use the authorities that we have to undermine that as best we can.
Mr. Glaser, in September of last year, the Bush administration designated the Saudi Al-Haramain charity as a group suspected of supporting terrorism through its main location in Ashland, Oregon, and a mosque in Springfield, Missouri. Assets of both have been frozen since February of 2004. How can it be explained why the Saudis have not shut down all worldwide branches of Al-Haramain as they would according to the State Department? In May of this year, a Treasury official told GAO that it was unclear whether the Saudi government had made any efforts to shut down other branches. What has the Department of the Treasury done to insist on compliance by the Saudis with their commitments? What can the Treasury Department do? And what will the Treasury Department do? I asked you 3 questions because my time just expired.
Okay, well, I'll try to answer all of them, Senator. With respect to Al-Haramain Foundation, obviously it's been a long concern of the Treasury Department and of the entire U.S. government, and frankly of the Saudi government as well. In 2000, I believe in 2002, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia jointly designated 2 branches of Al-Haramain Foundation in Bosnia and in Somalia. Subsequent to that, we jointly designated an additional 4 or 5, and then after that, designated more after that, all in conjunction with the Saudi Arabia. In addition to that, the Treasury Department designated the leader of Al-Haramain Foundation. I think at this point it is safe to say that Al-Haramain Foundation, as we've known it, is not functioning in the world, that there is not, the network, the Al-Haramain Foundation that we were concerned about in 2002, 2003, 2004 is no longer in existence. Now, with that said, there's always concerns with respect to any designation, be it Al-Haramain Foundation or any designation that we do, that the individuals who run these networks find other means of moving their money throughout the world. That's why this has to be a constant, vigilant attack. And we need to make sure that the individuals who were involved in Al Haramain are not finding alternate means of moving their money. They certainly haven't changed their views of the United States or of Israel or of Western civilization as a whole. I think, and I think this gets to the point I was trying to make in my testimony, both in my written and oral testimony, is that this is precisely the sort of issue that Saudi Arabia does need to be concerned about, and is to make sure that organizations which have been so closely associated with Saudi Arabia in the past that it is absolutely clear where Saudi Arabia stands with respect to those organizations, that it is absolutely clear that those organizations can find no comfort with the government of Saudi Arabia. I think in the case of Al Haramain, Saudi Arabia has made that clear, but we need to constantly be vigilant, we need to constantly be monitoring, we need to be constantly looking around the world to make sure that, that any entity we designate doesn't reconstitute itself through other mechanisms. And that's something that the United States government is quite aware of and is always trying to follow up on.
Thank you, Mr. Glaser. Senator Leahy?
Do you want to show the video?
No, we're after he testified. Okay.
Mr. Glaser, if the Saudi government, or its proxies, but sometimes can be just as important, were to provide direct funding to terrorist activities, we can, of course, prosecute those actions. Funding in these schools, as you suggest, is a lot more complicated. In some cases, they may simply provide education people wouldn't have had it otherwise. Others, we know they're doing a lot more than that. What steps, if any, are available to the Department of Treasury to address the Saudis' lavish fundings of madrasas when those schools directly advocate extremist interpretations of Islam, including hatred and violence? Or do we have any steps?
Thank you, Senator. I think that's an important question. The Treasury Department, I think, has a range of authorities that we could deploy against extremist ideology, against terrorist ideology worldwide. The first and most obvious tool is the one that Senator Specter and I were discussing, and that's designations, especially under Executive Order 13224. And we have and do aggressively use our authority in that area to try to undermine the networks that support global jihad, that support global extremism. And we do that whenever we feel appropriate. We've designated, you mentioned madrasas and charities. We've designated 41 charities under Executive Order 13224. And I fully agree with you, simply because a charity is engaged in beneficial social programs doesn't give it the right to also engage in terrorism. And if it's 99% social programs and 1% terrorism, that's 1% too much, and we have to take very aggressive action.
And the 1% you would move under these various laws if there was even that 1%?
Absolutely. If we think a charity is involved in terrorism, we will take whatever steps we can to shut that charity down.
Now, Account 98 has been described as a Saudi government account that funds Palestinian terrorist groups. The Saudis say the Account 98 no longer exists. Is Treasury convinced it no longer exists? I mean, how would you verify such a statement?
Account 98 has been an issue that we've raised with the Saudis many times over the years. I've personally raised it with the Saudis many times over the years. The Treasury Department has raised it with the Saudis many times over the years, as recently as just last month. Every time we raise Account 98 with the Saudis, we are assured that Account 98 no longer exists.
Does it exist?
We have been assured that Account 98 doesn't exist. Now, I understand.
Are you convinced that it doesn't then?
Well,
I mean, if you keep raising it, obviously these assurances from the Saudis are not convincing the Treasury Department. How do you feel?
Well,
is it there or isn't it?
As the senator pointed out, there was a recent broadcast that was broadcast through Saudi Arabia, which made reference to Account 98. It's very troubling. As I said, we raised that with the Saudis.
But Mr. Glaser, you're troubled. I'm troubled. A lot of people watching this are troubled. Are the Saudis telling the truth? Does Account 98 exist? In your opinion?
My opinion is that we need to look into this and verify that Account 98 does not exist, and we are doing
Okay.
so.
So you're not prepared to say, or let me put it, is it fair to say, in your opinion, it does exist and has been proven not to exist?
It has not been proven not to exist. It
Now
is something that
let's
is
move away from the double negatives. Does it exist?
Senator Leahy, I'm not trying to evade your question. I'm sorry if I appear to be. We are concerned with respect to the existence of Account 98.
Okay.
We are looking into the existence of Account 98. We have asked the Saudis to look into it as well. We have been assured that it doesn't, but we need to look into it.
Is it fair to say you have not been satisfied by the statements of the Saudis that Account 98 does not exist?
We think the Saudis and the United States need to look into this to ensure that it does not exist.
Now, in your testimony, you discussed the problem of international NGOs based in Saudi Arabia. The Saudis say these charities are de facto prohibited from sending funds abroad. Do you have confidence in that de facto prohibition? And is there a role for Treasury to play? Like the chairman, I made sure I ended that just as the clock ran out.
Let me just quickly back up for 1 second and explain how the Saudi regulations work with respect to charities and where the loopholes are in that regulatory structure. The Saudis do have a very, very aggressive, comprehensive regulatory structure with respect to the financial activities of charities, and I go into that in some detail in my testimony, and it's quite strict. There is an exception within that regulatory structure for certain charities that the Saudis regard as international or multilateral organizations. Those are the charities that I named: IARO, WAMI, and Muslim World League. The Saudis have assured us that nevertheless those charities are being treated as if they were under the regulations. And I can say that again, this is something else that the U.S. and the Saudi government need to look into more to ensure that these organizations are not, in fact, continuing to fund activities worldwide. In addition, and this is, I think, is a crucial point, and a point that I tried to make in my oral statement, is it's not just about these organizations' operations in Riyadh or their operations in Saudi Arabia. Equally of concern is their operations worldwide, which Saudi Arabia has asserted it has very little control over. That is, I think, one of the key issues that we need to continue to engage with the Saudis on, to emphasize to them that in our view these institutions, these entities are so closely associated with the Saudi government that they need to accept ownership of them, and they need to do everything they can to exert influence in every way that they can. And that's the type of leadership internationally that I think Saudi Arabia is capable of doing, and that I certainly hope and expect it will do in the future.
That's why I was driving it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. Senator Kyle?
Thank you. What was their response when you pointed out that the television advertisement as late August, August 29th of this year, specifically referred to Account 98?
They were as puzzled as we were. They asserted again that Account 98 does not exist.
One of the purposes of this hearing, I think, is to send a message of how disappointed we are in the Saudis. They're not going to change what is a very difficult situation to change, I'm sure, until they appreciate fully that most of the policymakers in the United States government are very, very disappointed in their lack of complete cooperation here. Your testimony verifies that we remain disappointed, and we remain committed to working with them to close a lot of these so-called loopholes. But obviously something stronger is going to be needed, and I think perhaps, since this is above your pay grade and I wouldn't hold you accountable to telling us what those policies should be, we can at least suggest that if changes are not more forthcoming than they have been, that they can fully expect policies to come from the United States Congress, and then the administration will have to determine how to deal with those policies. If the President signs legislation, it'll be up to people like you to implement it. But we can't continue with this sort of cat and mouse game that has characterized the relationship. it is also, I think, important to note that even if there were an absolute commitment by the Saudi government and a sincere desire on the part of the Saudi government to cooperate fully, it would still be a very difficult proposition because of the ingrained traditions in Saudi Arabia and the contributions of a lot of very wealthy individuals through a variety of means that find their way to support terrorism around the world and to support the propagation of the virulent Wahhabi version of Islam. So I don't discount the difficulty of dealing with this, but when you don't see the commitment of the government itself, that's 100%, and you know that even with that it would be very, very difficult. It's disappointing, and I think we have to be pretty clear about our intention to act in a stronger way. Given the fact that, as I said, this is above your pay grade, although I would frankly like to see a little stronger, I would expect it out of the State Department more than Treasury. Treasury, I think, could be a little tougher in this regard, but you're not the person to pick on here. We should deal directly with the people who can express the views on behalf of the United States of America directly to the Saudis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Kyle. Thank you, Mr. Glaser. As you hear from the panel, it's an issue of great concern, and we really think more has to be done, and we appreciate the interest which the Treasury Department has undertaken. Appreciate your efforts, but would encourage you and your colleagues in Treasury to do much, much more. We're now going to have a brief video presentation on monitoring which was done by the Middle East Media Research Institute's TV monitoring program on Saudi government-controlled television channels, TV1, TV2, as well as the Saudi satellite channel IGRA. They're continually monitored, and we have a short excerpt.
أن يحيي الجهاد والتضحية والمقاومة في العراق ضد المحتلين، ونحن نقنت عليهم كل ليل وكل سجدة أن الله يبيدهم وأن يمزقهم وأن ينصرنا عليهم. الحقيقة أن الجهاد الذي وقع في الفلوجة يرفع الرأس، وأنه شيء مذهل. مدينة فيها 250 ألف يخرجون لدولة عظمى بميزان الدنيا، فيسقطون من الطيارات ويبيدون من المعدات ويذبحونهم ويأسرونهم ويكبرون من منائر المساجد ويقنتون عليهم ويصلي مصليهم وخطيبهم، ويأتي أولئك يطلبون الصفحة ويطلبون الحوار والمهادنة والمفاوضة. من يملك أن يقول كلمة في الجهاد الحق هذا ضد المحتل؟ نعم، لابد أن يقدم مثل عبد العزيز الرنتيسي وأحمد ياسين وألوف، ويقدم بيوت ويقدم شباب وتضرب رقاب وتنسف جماجم. هذا خط النصر والشهادة والتضحية. يا أخي، أهل فيتنام وثنيون وكمبوديا وجنوب أفريقيا ما عرفت، ما عندها رسالة ولا شريعة، تقدم تضحيات وتقدم يعني قتلى وتقدم دماء وأرواح، فكيف نحن أمة الإسلام؟
ونسأل الله عز وجل أن يثبت المجاهدين في العراق وأن ينصرهم على أعدائهم من اليهود والنصارى. وكذلك يعني أنا أؤكد أن الجهاد الذي يقوم به المسلمون في العراق لدفع العدو الصائل من اليهود والنصارى الذي جاء يصول على الأرض والعرض، أن هذا الجهاد جهاد مشروع، وهو جهاد في سبيل الله ودفاع عن بلاد المسلمين وأعراض.
Glaser, would you care to comment about the advocacy on the favor of the jihad and the comments on retaliation against the Christians and the Jews?
Senator, I think that I probably have the same reaction that you have and that everybody in this room has. I mean, it's horrifying to see that sort of thing broadcast. It's what I and my colleagues throughout the U.S. government spend our entire days and our careers trying to fight against. And it's very troubling to see that type of hateful speech broadcast anywhere, and it's certainly troubling to see it broadcast in a place like Saudi Arabia. It's something that we need to all work very closely together to put an end to. It's absolutely unacceptable.
What is the response of the Saudi government when confronted with this unassailable evidence? They can't deny these words. They can't deny the means of disseminating this virulent, hateful propaganda, and they can't deny that they have the power to stop it. So what do they say?
And this is the great challenge for the Saudi government. I truly believe this is the great challenge for them. They have, I think they have come to understand that this type of speech, that this type of ideology is poisonous. It's poisonous in Saudi Arabia, it's poisonous in their region, and it's poisonous throughout the world. And they are taking steps, as I pointed out in my testimony, to try to turn some of this around. Now, as has been pointed out already, this is a very difficult challenge for them. And it is something that goes to the very heart of their role in the Arab world and in the Islamic world and in the international community. We are calling upon Saudi Arabia to take the steps that it needs to take to put this to an end. When we at the Treasury Department see opportunities to undermine the financial networks that support this type of activity, we take advantage of that, and we do that, and we have done so in the past, and we will continue to do so.
One of the items that I discussed specifically with Mr. Al-Jaber when he came to see me was the issue of what's in the school books. And there have been representations by the Saudis, and this is a recurrent problem throughout the entire Mideast, that they are taking care, at least for the next generation, to eliminate that kind of insidious propaganda. We're going to be having a witness later in the hearing today who will be testifying that that kind of propaganda is continuing. Have you heard any explanation or effort by the Saudi government to explain away that that kind of insidious propaganda directed to children?
I think I apologize. I'm not trying to duck any questions, Senator, but I do think that's a question better put to the State Department. At the Treasury Department, we are trying to work to undermine the financial networks that support these types of activities. As I said before, we have raised these activities with the Saudis in the context of some of the broadcasts which have referenced Account 98, and we, of course, are continuing to push the Saudis to take as aggressive action as possible.
When the State, pardon me for interrupting you, but the time is close to expiring, less than a minute now. When the State Department has confronted the Saudis, and I'm sorry the State Department representative is not here to answer this question directly, but you're the best we have, Mr. Glaser, so I'm going to ask you, when the State Department has confronted the Saudis, what have the Saudis said?
Well, I haven't been present for the discussions that our embassy and the State Department officials have had with the Saudis. I do think the Saudis are beginning to understand the threat that this type of ideology poses, not just to the kingdom, but to the world at large, and I think they are beginning to take steps to counter it. They are not.
They are beginning to take steps?
Yes, I think they're beginning to take steps.
When you say beginning, why just now beginning?
Well,
when did they begin? And two questions, time is almost up. When did they begin and what steps are they taking?
I think that the attacks in Riyadh in May 2003 were a wake-up call for Saudi Arabia that that terrorism and the extremist ideology that supports terrorism is a local problem for Saudi Arabia, that it's not just a theoretical global problem, but that it's a local problem for Saudi Arabia. And I think that we saw a significant change in the cooperation that we received from the Saudi government from May 2003 on. Now, I think the important thing for this, what I would like to see more of, is not simply focusing on Islamic extremism as it implicates the kingdom itself, but the exportation of Islamic extremism. That's some of the very same points that you made yourself, Senator. With respect to some of these NGOs, some of these non-governmental organizations that I mentioned in my testimony, that you yourself have mentioned, it is important that Saudi Arabia take ownership of the problem, of the ideology that is put forth by those organizations, and take every action it can to make sure that those organizations, which were purportedly set up for charitable purposes, are not being abused and put to hateful and terrorist ends.
Thank you, Mr. Glaser. I'm advised that these clips are available for viewing in the United States via satellite TV. Senator Leahy, further questions?
No, I just share your concern. The State Department would not send somebody up here. I don't. Mr. Glaser has done a great job. Right? It's unfortunate he has to be the one to answer these, because ultimately the State Department has to take strong steps. I mean, one of the things I would have asked Secretary Rice or her representative, is she willing to speak out strongly when she goes to Saudi Arabia? I mean, it's not speaking out strongly to have the top official of our country say that the Saudis have the same similar commitment to democracy that we saw in our Constitution. I would point out that we have the First Amendment, which guarantees the right to practice any religion you want, or none if you want, and guarantees your freedom of speech. There are no guarantees in Saudi Arabia, anything like that. I must admit to a concern. I've never had adequate answers about why we flew a plane load of Saudis out of this country right after 9/11, even though most of the hijackers were Saudis. When the FBI testified here, they say, well, we had FBI agents go in and talk to them before they took off. I asked if any FBI agents spoke Arabic. Of course, none did. We are far too cozy with the country that has provided the terrorists who have hit us here. When Undersecretary Levy, according to your testimony, said that wealthy Saudi individuals are still funding violent extremists around the world, is there anything specifically we can do to stop that funding? I mean, other than say we hope that they will stay true to their commitment to democracy, which is carefully hidden.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. Just to address one of the previous points you make, and then I'll certainly give you a direct answer to your question. I do think that we have spoken out forcefully with respect to Saudi Arabia. I think it's important that we be balanced in what we say, but I was in Saudi Arabia earlier this year with Homeland Security Advisor Fran Townsend, and I can tell you that she was quite unambiguous in the U.S. commitment to support democracy in the region, and support democracy within Saudi Arabia. So I think that we have spoken out quite clearly and directly to the Saudis on that issue. With respect to what we can do with respect to donors, private donors within Saudi Arabia, as we locate these donors, there's a number of tools that we have at our disposal. We do have designations at the Treasury tool, designations under Executive Order 13224, and we have used those. We have used those against wealthy Saudi donors in Saudi Arabia, Baderji, Jalaid, and these are examples of wealthy Saudi donors that we have designated. Now, there are other options that we have. We have a joint task force on the ground with IRS Criminal Investigative Division and the FBI working very closely with Saudi police to pursue law enforcement and those types of actions with respect to these donors as we come up with them. But what is vital is that we have the information that we need to pursue these. This is not something, obviously, that we could do at the Treasury Department. As we get the information, we act upon it. But it would, what we do, it is at the end of the day, if an individual is in a particular country, we need to work very closely with that country in order to have success with respect to responding to that individual. And that's why the relationship with Saudi Arabia is so important, because there are wealthy donors in Saudi Arabia, as Under Secretary Levy said. And we need as much cooperation as we can get to make sure that we crack down on them.
I couldn't agree with you more. Couldn't agree with you more. Thank you, Mr. Glaser. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. Senator Kyle will be rejoining us, but does not have any further questions. So we thank you for coming in, Mr. Glaser. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator.
Now call our second panel, Mr. Anthony Quartersman, Mr. Steve Emerson, Ms. Nina Shea, and Mr. Ghulam Bakalai. We had requested or invited the Saudi government to send a representative to these hearings. In our policy of being balanced and asking people on all sides to testify, the Saudi government declined, but did recommend Mr. Anthony Quartersman as a prospective witness, and he will lead our second panel. Professor Quartersman holds the Arleigh A. Burke Chair in Strategy, co-director of the Mideast program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's a military analyst for ABC, served in senior positions in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, State and Energy, and the Defense Advanced Research Projects. Written extensively on security developments in North Africa, Arab-Israeli states, and I go, thank you for agreeing to come in, Mr. Quartersman, and our practice is to have 5-minute statements and then 5-minute rounds of questioning by members of the panel. The floor, Mr. Quartersman, Professor Quartersman, is yours.
Thank you very much, Senator. This is an extraordinarily complex set of issues, and I do have a formal statement for the record, which I request.
Your formal statement will be made a part of the record in full, as will all other statements which have been submitted to the committee.
Let me just make a few quick points in introduction. The first point is, if you pick the worst, you get the worst. And there are organizations which make almost a full-time effort to find the worst possible rhetoric in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Arab states, and Islamic countries. Just unfortunately, as there are other organizations which are equally indiscriminate in finding the worst rhetoric from nations like Israel. But much of what has been said is very real. And Saudi Arabia is going to take time at best to make the changes that it should make. What bothers me about the approach that you are taking is, frankly, I do not believe singling out Saudi Arabia or Wahhabi practices focuses on the real problem. I think neo-Salafi movements are not derived from Saudi practices. They have their origin in ideologies coming from Egypt, which indeed is where bin Laden derived his ideology, or Zarqawi, for that matter. There are some very good analyses of what the broader issues are in Islamic extremism by the Crisis Group, which I think would be described as one of the most balanced looks by any organization at the problems and tensions in this region. And I would commend that to the committee. There's one called Understanding Islamism, which is a report they issued in March of this year. And I think the great problem we face here is also understanding just how serious anger is against us in the Islamic and Arab world and the reasons for which that anger occurs. It is, unfortunately, our alliance with Israel. It is our presence in Iraq. These are not policies I in any way oppose, but they do have a very powerful cost. And if you look at polls of popular reactions in Jordan or Morocco or Turkey or other Islamic countries or countries with strong Islamic movements, you find a broad-based support for extremism and sometimes violence and bin Laden, which has nothing to do with Wahhabi practices or beliefs. The second point I would make is I do see real progress in Saudi Arabia. I don't think you're going to get instant progress. I've never seen instant progress in any aspect of that country, and I have been pushing for reforms in it for several decades and long before 9/11. But they have cooperated with us in spite of the fact they did not support the Iraq War, in the Iraq War. They have had an increasing effort in counterterrorism, and in my visits there, I find the embassy and people in the U.S. security community are praising the increase in that cooperation. Is it complete? No. I do have to say that, frankly, I think some of the discussion here this morning on the financing of terrorism is ridiculous. I would love to see somebody stop talking in generic terms and tell me what the financing streams are by terrorist organization, because I don't believe that Saudi Arabia is the cause. I think most of these organizations have ample sources of other funding. And if it had not been for 9/11, I think we would be focusing on the fact that Qatar, Egypt, and many other countries have a powerful flow of private money. And given the fact that there's nearly, at this point, $1 billion worth of private capital in private facilities in Europe, your chances of controlling this are about as good as your chances of winning the war on drugs. But in areas like education, in areas like religion, I think you do see movements toward reform. Quoting or having excerpts from a satellite program that isn't based in Saudi Arabia doesn't really tell you very much about Saudi television coverage. Picking out the worst of what is said in Saudi Arabia doesn't. And I think we need to be very careful this morning and in the future to focus on Saudi Arabia's very real problems and the pace of reform that can occur, and not to ignore the nature of what is happening in this region as a whole. I do believe that we have many tools, and I'll be happy to discuss them with the committee if you are interested in what I would suggest, that we could do a much better job as a government, not only in dealing with Saudi Arabia, but with dealing with all of the countries in this region. But the fact that 9/11 had 15 Saudis is not the issue here. It could as easily have come from Egypt or Morocco or many of the other countries where these movements occur. And they're not Wahhabi, and that is not their source of origin.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Quartersman. Our next witness is Mr. Stephen Emerson, Executive Director of the Investigative Project on Terrorism, one of the world's largest data and intelligence centers on Islamic and Middle East terrorist groups, internationally recognized expert, frequently testifying before congressional committees on the operational networks of Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and the other terrorist organizations. We appreciate your being here, Mr. Emerson, and look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Specter, and thank you, Senator Lee, for having this hearing, which I believe resulted in the State Department yesterday releasing its report on violations of religious freedoms. So,
I think that was a coincidence?
The State Department acts in strange and mysterious ways.
Let me interrupt you for just a minute on that, Mr. Emerson, and we'll start your clock back at 5 minutes. But I think it's informative and significant. But why do you think this hearing motivated the release of the report?
I think the fact that the hearing was supposed to be held 2 weeks ago, and that it was delayed, and that it was held now without the participation of the State Department, meant that they were seen as almost obstructing the hearing or impeding it.
Almost obstructing?
All right, obstructing. We'll take out the qualification, and I think
Thank
this
you
was...
for the instant modification.
And I think the opportunity for them to basically try to deflect some of the culpability for obstructing the hearing was manifest in the presentation of that report, which I think is a good report. It should have been presented last month pursuant to the act that was passed by Congress.
Your 5 minutes begin now.
All right, thank you. 20 years ago, I wrote a book called The American House of Saud, The Secret Petrodollar Connection. It was written in 1985, and it talked about the political strings attached to Saudi Arabia's investments and donations and funding to academic centers in the United States, and how it essentially acquired legitimacy by purchasing it through registered agents and donations. I find myself now, 20 years later, returning over and over to the same problem. Now look, in the years prior to 9/11, the U.S. government and most everybody else paid little attention to the flow of money and propaganda coming from Saudi Arabia, promoting the Wahhabist agenda. And there is no doubt, as my co-panelist, Dr. Cordesman, has stated, that Saudi Arabia is not the only exporter, or shouldn't be targeted as the exclusive exporter of militant Islam, because the Muslim Brotherhood has done that for years. But Saudi Arabia's petrodollars have been absolute vehicles, and their legitimacy as the custodian of Islam, as they have represented themselves, have given them the ability to project their views of Islam, which I do not believe represents mainstream Islam, but it unfortunately has had a domino chain reaction in influencing the views of organizations and madrasats and other institutions around the world. Because of its vast petrodollar riches, it's been able to pursue its puritanical interpretation, described in shorthand as Wahhabism, in indoctrinating young Muslims, controlling the direction of major Islamic religious institutions, and extending the Wahhabist doctrine around the four corners of the globe. The question now we face in 2005 is whether, in fact, Saudi Arabia has changed. All the representations that they need time post 9/11, that they're actually redirecting the activities of the NGOs, that they're exercising controls over the organizations, that they're trying to stop the export of extremism. How true is this? Have they actually changed the textbooks? Have they actually reined in those NGOs? Those are the metrics that we need to be specifically focusing on. Now, I can't pretend that I have all the answers, but I can tell you that pursuing an investigation, as I have for the last 10 years, and over the course of the last year in particular, looking at Saudi Arabia websites, publications, broadcasts, textbooks, and the institutional recipients here in the United States, I can say that there are certain conclusions that I would come to. One, Saudi organizations and leaders operating with the permission or acquiescence of the Saudi regime continue to promote a virulent anti-Western propaganda and raise serious questions of whether the regime itself is trying to comprehensively crack down on the sources and support for Islamic terrorism. While there have been efforts to sanitize Saudi websites and publications, the fact of the matter is there are still significant websites, including those officially attached to the Saudi government, that call for jihad and that disseminate anti-Christian or anti-Jewish theology. There have been some constraints imposed by the Saudi government on NGOs, but in fact, the primary perpetrators and disseminators of radical Islamic theology, the Muslim World League, the World Assembly of Muslim Youth, have not been reined in under the official governance and package announced by the Saudi government. Saudi funding of Hamas continues. There was a courier arrested in Israel in September, and apparently he was a courier transferring funds between Saudi Arabia and the Palestinian territories. Saudi government officials, in response to questions about whether, in fact, they are involved in stopping the flow of extremism, have vehemently claimed that they are, but they have made outrageous anti-Semitic allegations in claiming somehow that the al-Qaeda attacks in Saudi Arabia that have occurred since 2003 are part of a Zionist conspiracy. Saudi religious figures continue to call for jihad routinely against the United States. Saudi officials in the United States and American recipients of Saudi funds here continue to detract attention from the extremists by alleging there's a campaign against Saudi extremism that is racist. In fact, it is the Saudi campaign that is racist. Senior Islamic terrorists, Yassin al-Qadi and others designated by the United States as al-Qaeda supporters have never been sanctioned. So in the end, the question is, what are the metrics? How are we going to verify their representations to us? And I believe the record shows that the campaign of quiet diplomacy, of trying to nudge them along and push them without publicly criticizing them, has not paid the dividends that we need to see. And therefore, I believe your act that you have supported is something that would be vitally important in putting them on record and demanding a set of metrics and standards that they have to adhere to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Emerson. Our next witness is Ms. Nina Shea, Director of the Center for Religious Freedom, serves on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and represented the United States as a public delegate to the UN Commission on Human Rights in 1993 and again in 2001. Their organization recently published the Saudi Publications on Hate Ideology Fill American Mosques in January of this year. We appreciate your coming in, Ms. Shea, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. 2 years ago, a Muslim American friend and colleague of mine handed me this little pamphlet and told me to read it. It was in Arabic, and so we had it translated. And it says, it gives detailed instructions on how to build a wall of resentment between the Muslim and the infidel. Never greet the Christian or Jew first, never congratulate the infidel on his holiday, never befriend an infidel unless it is to convert him, never imitate the infidel, never work for the infidel, do not wear a graduation gown because this imitates the infidel, and so on. And the cover of this book, giving this particular instruction, states, greetings from the cultural attaché, Washington, D.C. This from the Embassy of Saudi Arabia here in Washington. So Freedom House, the Center for Religious Freedom, decided to go forward and take on a study addressing the question, is Saudi Arabia, our purported ally in the war on terror, responsible for having planted extremist propaganda within our borders? In order to document the Saudi influence, the material for this report was gathered from a selection of more than a dozen prominent sites in large American cities. And these materials have publication dates of over spanning 4 decades, including dates after 9/11. The study did not attempt any general survey of American mosques or American Muslims. In fact, we believe American Muslims overwhelmingly reject these directives. The various Saudi publications gathered for the study state that it is the religious obligations for Muslims to hate Christians and Jews and warn against imitating or helping them in any way. They instill contempt for America because the U.S. is ruled by legislated civil law rather than by totalitarian Wahhabi-style Islamic law. Some of the publications direct Muslims not to take American citizenship as long as the country is ruled by infidels. The textbooks and documents our researchers, who themselves were Muslim, preach a Nazi-like hatred for Jews and treat the protocols of the Elders of Zion as historical fact. And Mr. Chairman, as you know, this protocols was a document used by Hitler to indoctrinate Nazi youth, now being exported by Saudi Arabia, by the government of Saudi Arabia to the United States. These documents show a particular vicious hatred towards other Muslims, especially those who advocate tolerance. These Muslims are condemned as infidels. The opening fatwa in one embassy distributed booklet responds to a question by a Muslim preacher in Europe who taught that it is not right to condemn Christians and Jews as infidels. And the Saudi state cleric's reply rebukes the Muslim cleric, "He who cast doubt upon their infidelity leaves no doubt about his." And that is basically a death threat, because in Saudi Arabia it's a crime, a capital offense to be an apostate. Sufi and Shiite Muslims are also viciously condemned in these documents. Others in our collection declare that Muslims who engage in interfaith dialogue are also unbelievers. Regarding those who fail to uphold Wahhabi sexual mores through homosexual activity or heterosexual activity outside of marriage, the edicts found here advise, quote, "It would be lawful for Muslims to spill his blood and take his money." Regarding those who convert out of Islam, it is explicitly asserted in some of these documents they should be killed. They show an ideology that embraces a dualistic worldview in which there exist two antagonistic realms that can never be reconciled, and that when Muslims are in the land of the infidel, they must behave as if on a mission behind enemy lines. So this is an ideology whose message is that Muslims should live in ghettoized enclaves with enmity and hostility against others. An insidious aspect of this propaganda is its attempt to replace traditional and moderate interpretations of Islam with Wahhabi extremism. These replies in the fatwa collections distributed by the embassy and by other agencies of the government, whether it's the education ministry or cultural ministry, are given in authoritative pronouncements that the introduction should be official guides for preachers, mosque imams, and students living far from the kingdom. So this is a hate-filled ideology, not just speech, and it is educational and authoritative. Mr. Chairman, my time is out. I just want to say we have not attempted to measure, again, the impact of this here. We know that King Fahd states that the cost for spreading this stuff has been astronomical on the King Fahd website, which is still up even though he is gone. We haven't measured the effect. I know that most Muslims here are law-abiding citizens. Mr. Aliyami, who is here today, saw firsthand in Saudi Arabia. He is a Saudi dissident living here now. He doesn't want to see this stuff here. His son served honorably in Iraq with the American military as an officer. So this is not a comment on American Muslims. It's a comment on Saudi Arabian government responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Shea. Our next witness is Mr. Ghulam Bakalai. Serves on the Board of Trustees of the Directors of the Islamic Association of Northern Texas, was formerly its chairman. Mr. Bakalai's mosque was one of the mosques surveyed in the Freedom House report. He's project manager for Lockwood Green, a major global engineering construction firm. Thank you very much for coming to Washington today, Mr. Bakalai, and we are very much interested in your testimony. You may proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you, Senator Spector, and the rest of the members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about this report. Our basic focus is to talk about who we are, as referenced in the report. Organization is referenced in those literature that was picked up, and it is incumbent upon me this morning on behalf of my community to help explain what we are rather than being extrapolated otherwise. At the very beginning, our mosque has neither been filled or invaded by the literature alluded to in the report. Majority of our congregation do not understand Arabic as a language to even read, absorb, and propagate the line of thinking alleged to be advanced by such documents. Furthermore, the total number of books and literature, we have thousands. INT, being the largest organization in the area, provides a library as a service to not only Muslims, but all faith-based groups for research and special projects. Our records indicate that the books referenced in the Freedom House report as collected from the Richardson Mosque were not found in the library, were not ordered or purchased by INT, were not distributed to the congregation, were not read from to the INT congregation, were not promoted for purchase to the congregation, and were definitely not used to develop or author any position paper to promote a point of view. In fact, majority members do not access the library unless there's a dire need for academic research or something similar. The library operations amount to a small portion of what we currently do. We certainly feel that we have been wronged by this report that initially was published this year. We certainly have no knowledge of such documents being present, nor have we ever endorsed these material. We invite you and the committee to visit our facility and see our community firsthand. We have submitted for the record all our activities, and I urge you to indulge in those. You may join us at any of our Friday prayers, any classes, and any interfaith events. In the past several years, hundreds of government officials and candidates have observed our Friday prayers. Our U.S. senators, along with several of U.S. Congress representatives, have been to our community gatherings. City of Richardson officials know us very well. FBI officials, both past and present, know many of our leaders personally and have been to many interfaith and community gatherings. We'd love to host any of you who seek to understand us further and ask questions. Only by asking and listening to each other can we initiate and establish a better understanding about who we are as Americans. I have been with this organization 25 years continuously and can say with conviction some of the defining attributes as to who we are. A place of worship for Muslims? Yes. A place for advanced Islamic studies, those who want to do more soul searching. A private school teaching Islamic and public school curriculum 6 days a week throughout the year, very rigorous, more so than any private school. A free medical clinic for the underprivileged. A place where other faith-based organizations can collaborate. Home for the youth to learn leadership skills. Scouts and the Habitat for Humanity. All these data have been submitted to you. A place where women can do their own programs, a welcoming center for new arrivals on the American shores. We have a refugee center, an adult retraining center for those who have been affected by the economy, computer classes and whatnot, a banquet hall, gymnasium for parties, events, basketball games, a humanitarian civics group indulging in soup kitchen, adopt a highway, Katrina relief, and so on. And most recently, the last 5 years or so, we've been a very prominent member for the State Department's International Visitor Leadership Program and have hosted visitors from at least 12 to 15 countries. And this certainly does not paint a picture of an indoctrinated community recluse to themselves and full of hate for America. We are very proud of our 30-year heritage in the North Texas region as a place of worship and, more importantly, a center for sharing information about Islam in America in particular. We plan to continue our open door policy wherein every segment, group, race, or faith-based organization of our society is welcome to join us, understand who we are, and share their concerned beliefs to help enrich our society. Our partners and patrons are many, and they can further attest about our organization and what we stand for. Not to single a few out, but Thanksgiving Square, City of Richardson, Habitat for Humanity, Carter Blood Center, Arapahoe United Methodist Church, North Texas Foods Bank, and the list goes on. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Senator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bacalai, for your testimony, and we acknowledge at the outset that the Muslim community in the United States has contributed a great deal to our country and to our culture, and we welcome the Muslim community as a nation welcomes the very diverse representations which we have in our country. And when we express concern about what some extremists do, it does not reflect in any way upon the Muslims in America. We regard you as first-class American citizens, and I think it's important to keep that in perspective, and the experience you've had on the Board of Trustees and Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Islamic Association of North Texas is very important to bring before the committee, so we thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Ms. Shea, you have quoted from some of the documents from the Saudi embassy. Is there anything specific in those documents which relates to the information given to children in textbooks?
Well, we have collected from various sites textbooks as well. And for example, this one has the Saudi seal on it, and it is published by, these are published by the Education Ministry or the Girls Teaching. Some of these textbooks
What do the textbooks contain relevant to the issue of how Christians are characterized, how Americans are characterized, how Jews are characterized?
Absolutely. Third-year high school textbook, for example, talks about don't help or imitate the infidel, Christians and Jews in any way. 11th grade textbook in our collection is very anti-Semitic, saying Jews lured women to go to work, that kind of thing.
Well, never mind what kind of thing. Let's hear it. Can you read it? While you're taking a look at it, Mr. Emerson, you referred to textbooks in the course of your testimony. Do you have anything specific to put into the record as to what the textbooks contain with respect to how Americans are characterized, or Christians are characterized, or Jews are characterized?
2 years ago, we collected a series of textbooks that were published by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and disseminated by the embassy here in Washington. Now, I can't represent that they are still being circulated today, those particular textbooks, but I did speak to several people in the Middle East in the last 2 weeks as we were preparing for this testimony in terms of having them try to acquire current textbooks. We spoke to several people actually in Saudi Arabia who are involved right now in securing some of the current textbooks. But I can tell you that textbooks that continue to be in circulation in the U.S. as well as in Europe, published by the Kingdom, have called specifically...
Can you give us a date when they were published by the Kingdom?
Yes, we can give you, I will...
What is the date?
The dates that we have of some of those publications go back to the 1990s and early 2000 period.
And do you have any evidence that they are currently in use?
We have evidence that some of them are still in use in the United States, and some of them are still being used in Europe. I can't represent that that at this date in November that those books are still being used in Saudi Arabia, and to a certain extent, they can't necessarily be blamed if books that they have now stopped publishing and if they've disavowed, which would be great, are being used by others.
Have they been disavowed?
Not as far as I know. They claim that they have sanitized some of the textbooks. They have claimed that, and this has been a big issue.
Have you asked them for evidence on that?
I have not asked them directly for evidence. We have tried to acquire the textbooks directly from Saudi educational institutions, and we're in the process of acquiring them now.
Professor Quartersman, you testified that there have been improvements, as you characterized the reform in education and religion. Could you be more specific? As a subpart of the question, do you know firsthand knowledge whether there has been a change in the Saudi textbooks testified to by Ms. Shea and Mr. Emerson?
There has been a change in the textbooks. The problem is that nobody knows how quickly they're being disseminated. You are talking about a relatively large country.
But you have seen specific changes in the textbooks?
Yes, I have seen copies of the changes. I don't sit around and collect the textbooks, Senator, and I have to have them translated as others do, because these are not easy to deal with. It is part of a 3-year program as well. It is not going to be quick or instant. It is a political struggle for the Saudi government. You are dealing with not only a very conservative people, but unfortunately a significant number of Jordanian, Egyptian, and very conservative teachers. And this really is not something that's going to be quick or easy. But those textbooks are being changed, and frankly, I would ask the committee to ask the Saudis to provide the demonstrations, because for anybody on the outside, you are asking us to count the impossible. On the side of the clergy, I have seen, frankly, more obvious signs, because there are protests when I visit Saudi Arabia, and some of the imams have been disciplined. Now, part of the problem is every imam in Saudi Arabia, where there are no madrasas in the kingdom, is a government employee. And you have a long legacy of people who, frankly, at the extremes, were allowed to preach and say almost anything as long as it didn't have internal political impact. It is not going to be easy to change that clergy, but the fact that they are complaining about the government's interference and the government is encountering problems is at least a reassuring sign.
My time expired in the middle of your answer, but I will make just one comment with respect to what you have requested the committee to do. We have asked the Saudi government for the texts and have not received them. The textbooks are said to being in the process of being translated. This follows a recurrent pattern of seeking information and being delayed and not getting it, but it is something the committee is pursuing. Senator Kyle?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just begin, Tony, with you. You say we can't demand instant change, and nobody is suggesting that things have to change instantly, but we're looking for demonstrated efforts in the right direction. There are simply a lot of folks who, while acknowledging efforts that have been made, don't see them as enough. Secondly, you know that others are radical too, and they promote it, noting people from Egypt and so on, and that's true. But the big bucks have come from Saudi Arabia. Let me ask you this question. I alluded to it before. The former General Counsel of the Department of Treasury testified before my subcommittee that that Saudi Arabia was the epicenter for terrorist financing around the world. And that was just a couple of years ago. You note that Saudi Arabia began to try to control funding in the 1990s, and that governmental efforts to control terrorist financing have sharp limits and have probably reached the point of diminishing returns. Do you disagree with the Treasury Department's earlier statement, or are you saying that the situation has been corrected since then?
Quite frankly, I disagree with it. I frankly find this whole approach, I have seen this used in many other cases by government officials and by the intelligence community. If you want to know where the financing is, you look at the individual movements and you try to figure out whether you have real evidence. You do not go with generalizations. If I say that there are Mennonite terrorists in Pennsylvania and they get $13 billion a year from Germany, and I repeat it often enough, somebody may actually believe it. But when I want to know where in bin Laden's organization the money actually is coming from, I don't ask about generic money. I want to know where that financing is. The same with Zarqawi inside Iraq. It would be true in other cases that the financing probably was Saudi. Certainly it was in the Pakistani madrasas that this committee is focused on. But one needs to be careful about the content of those madrasas, because it was President Zia of Pakistan who was encouraging those madrasas as a counterbalance to the secular movements inside Pakistan, and that was perfectly all right for us as long as this was part of getting the Soviets out of Afghanistan.
Tony, we're getting kind of far afield, and I don't agree with that policy any more than I gather you do. I'm primarily interested in just in your view about this terrorist financing, and the people from the Treasury Department have gotten very specific about specific bank accounts in specific countries and specific charities and so on.
Senator, there's a vast amount of Saudi money out there that shouldn't have gone where it has gone.
Exactly.
but the recipients of the money and their ties to terrorism. The idea that somehow Saudi Arabia is the source of the money on which these groups depend, as I think you know, there is a member of the Qatari royal family who contributes significant amount of monies to this cause. I could go down case after case.
There are others, but would you disagree with this statement that of all of the places where funding for terrorist-related activity has come from, that the largest single country from which it comes is Saudi Arabia? Would you disagree with that statement?
I think if you talk about moving money out of a country to extremist organizations, it would be Saudi Arabia. If you talked about what dominates terrorist financing, which is what you began with, it would not be Saudi Arabia.
Steve Emerson, let me ask you, since your original testimony was cut short a little bit, to comment on this exchange right now, please.
Well, I think I'd make several points. One is, I don't think we can make this clear distinction between, quote, terrorist financing. You can make a clear distinction legally between terrorist financing versus financing of extremism, but I think it should be very clear that the massive billions of dollars the Saudi Arabian government has pumped into radical Islam and the Wahhabist views of Islam in terms of their publications, websites, NGOs that are quasi-official representatives of the government, have promoted a view of the world in which it is legitimate to attack infidels or Jews or Christians, and you can carry out 9/11 style attacks. So the extremist funding coming from Saudi Arabia has created the environment and the virus in which terrorism occurs. Now, the issue is trying to get a handle on this. I believe that the Saudi abilities have the Saudi willingness to curtail the financing of Islamic extremist movements. They have not been willing to publicly declare and follow up, emphasis on the follow-up in terms of restricting the flows of money. WAMI, MWL, those are two NGOs that are fundamentally anti-Semitic and anti-Christian. Let me just read you one quote here. It was from a New York Times story in 2004. I'll read you the quote. Quote, saying that the Jews and the Christians are infidels is part of our religious dogma, said Salah S. al-Wahabi, the American-educated Secretary General of the World Assembly of Muslim Youth. Any changes in the way it is taught should be decided by the Saudis, he said, adding, quote, it doesn't mean we try to incite hatred against others, but my religion has its own principles that should not be violated or changed. In other words, his dogma is hatred of Jews and Christians. And unfortunately, you can see that representative today, even on official Saudi government websites. Look, they could take down these sites. Alislam.com, which is part of the Saudi Arabian Ministry of Islamic Affairs, Endowments, Dawah, and Guidance, continues to call for killing Jews. MWL's website in Canada calls Jews a racist religion. I could go list over and over in specifics. I know Dr. Korsman said we want specifics. I don't deal in generalities. I deal in specifics. And the specifics are that the regime itself is wrapped up and continues to promote an ideological virus that unfortunately ends up legitimizing terrorist attacks. Because in the end, terrorism can only flow from the decision by someone who says it's acceptable to kill somebody else who's not my religion.
And I would note, Mr. Chairman, that we have focused not just on the funding of cells of terrorists conducting violent operations, but also on the whole question of the winning of the hearts and minds, the incitement to terror which precedes the action itself. So I think both of the points are legitimate.
Thank you very much, Senator Kyle. Senator Schumer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the hearing and the efforts of all of our witnesses here. You know, I'd say this to Mr. Kortzman. You can point out other bad examples, but what's gone on in Saudi Arabia is plain as the nose on your face, on any of our faces. And that is that there has been a link to Wahhabism all along. I think I don't know if it's called the official Saudi religion, but it is. And Wahhabism believes in many, many extreme things, such as Mr. Emerson outlined. And here's what I think happened. Well, I want to ask you, I mean, do you disagree with any of the specifics that he cited? Are any of them wrong? Is it true that an official Saudi website, how would we react in America or anywhere else, had said that it's okay to kill Jews? Why don't they take that down? And don't you think that their precarious political balance, where the royal family needs Wahhabism to protect itself and make itself okay to the people, is sort of a deal, almost a deal with, you know, I don't want to use the word, but a deal with someone very bad?
No, Senator, I don't agree with you.
Okay,
First,
well,
are there
explain to me
examples? There are many of them. Are there other examples in Wahhabi teaching which have a completely different view? Yes. Do I watch, as Senator Leahy pointed out, similar examples of extremism and poor rhetoric on the parts of Christians? And does that lead me to generalize about Christian teaching in the U.S.?
No one is generalizing, sir, about Muslim teaching or Islam. I'm asking
talking
you about Wahhabism.
And that is specifically what I am answering, because I have been going in and out of that country for more than 30 years.
And you think Wahhabism, the main thrust of Wahhabism is not what these two folks have been talking about, that hatred, that inferiority of non-Muslims and non-Wahhabi Muslims isn't part of the warp and woof of Wahhabism?
I think it is part of the margin. I think it is part of the extreme views in there. I think it is very carelessly included with a great deal of other teaching.
When anyone writes to the Saudi government and says, take this off your website, I'd like to know, I mean, your main testimony, as I watched it, has been they're not doing as many bad things as they used to. I'd like to know affirmative things they do to stop all of this. I believe in affirmative action here in America, okay? Even though I believe it because we've had a long, tawdry history about race, and we ought to make up for it until there's equality. Well, the Saudis have had a long, tawdry history. Wahhabism has a long, tawdry history in terms of this hatred. I mean, as you know, it was okay. Terrorism against Jews in Israel was perfectly okay. Women, children. There are countless statements where Saudi leaders have said that's okay, and only after 9/11, when it started being directed at other people, did they officially sort of change their view. I think it was a short step from one to the other. Shouldn't they be, if they've changed? Shouldn't there be some affirmative signs? Shouldn't they take a website like this down? Saying we're doing less of bad things isn't good enough. Can you point to some affirmative things that they are doing to undo the decades of hatred leading to terrorism that has been spewed from large parts, in my judgment, of Saudi society and of Wahhabism?
First, Senator, to just correct the record, Saudi Arabia officials from King Fahd's time on were very clear about not supporting violence against Israel.
Aren't there
and
leaders of the
supporting a
Saudi
peace
government
plan.
that did support it? Interior ministers and others
I think one needs to
appointed
be,
by King Fahd?
There were certainly Prince Naif who criticized Israel. He did not support, to my knowledge, any attacks on Jews or men and women or terrorism. And indeed, in the case which Mr. Emerson quoted, he went on from attacking Zionist causes to promptly attack the Muslim Brotherhood. So it is probably useful to keep things in context. But to go to your specific question,
Wahhabism attacks many branches of Muslim, too.
it is an extraordinarily puritanical belief. And having encountered a few puritanical Jews and Christians, I don't like the level of inherent discrimination on any of them.
Okay.
But you asked about specific measures, and in my written testimony I point out there has been a really significant advertising campaign. It has been mixed with efforts to have television shows to deal with education. This is a matter of public record. You can just look at the part of that campaign that took place very openly in Saudi Arabia. It started in February of this year. So that is something that the committee can easily confirm. The efforts to actually re-educate or discipline imams, which are not going to be something that you see advertised in every Saudi newspaper, have been real. The efforts which began after 9/11 by the Ministry of Education and particularly with Prince Salman's leadership, but which now have taken on a considerable momentum, have begun to change the textbooks. Do I like the rate at which this progress has occurred? No, I don't. Do I believe that this progress is occurring in many of the countries which have similar kinds of anger and hatred at the level I'd like to see? No, I don't. But is there progress? Yes. And I've given you 3 tangible cases.
Without specifics. I mean, I guess they're in your testimony. I did not read it. Do you have specifics?
I've given
you
you
asked
this.
for specifics. You wanted specifics in reference to Senator Kyle's question. Give me the most specific, positive thing. What do these advertising campaigns say? Do they say it was a mistake that many people advocated killing of Jews?
The problem you have, Senator, is you begin with the thesis that many people are going around advocating the killing of Jews. I've been in Saudi Arabia on many occasions. I haven't heard that. And I have been there with colleagues of mine that are Jewish. And it is not exactly as if this was something that I saw.
In Israel? You haven't heard that in Saudi Arabia?
I've heard people attack me in Saudi Arabia for being Jewish, for being a supporter of Israel. I have heard them use rhetoric which was about as personally vicious as you can get. Did they represent any significant number of the Saudis that I deal with and have dealt with over the years? No.
I don't know. Could I ask Mr. Emerson to respond to a few?
Well, you're only 2.5 minutes over time, so the answer is yes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you are always fair.
Thank you. I think bottom line here is that, one, the institutional leadership of the regime, the family, the NGOs that were set up, the Saudi industrials who operate at the sufferance of the regime itself. This is not a totally capital and free market country, have all been involved in promoting a severe puritanical version of Islam, but which has called Jews and Christians infidels for years. And the question is, I'm amazed that this would be compared to the current situation with Judaism and Christianity, because bottom line is, we in the West have largely excised much of our religious fundamentalism. Yes, there are fundamentalists in every religion, and there are terrorists in every religion, but the radical Islamic theology, as promoted by Saudi Arabia, is the centerpiece, and has been. Now, the question is, have they changed? And the mark for that is the metrics. The other mark is whether they will own up, as you appropriately asked, whether they will own up to the fact that they did promote this. And I can give you several examples that unfortunately show an effort to basically lie, fabricate stuff. This year, in April, NBC obtained a tape of a prominent Saudi sheikh, the Chief Justice of Saudi Arabia's Supreme Judicial Council, exhorting young Muslims to go to Iraq to participate in the jihad against American forces. NBC asked Saudi officials here in the United States for their reaction. You know what their response was? The tape was fabricated, that this was digitally created, enhanced. They warned them that this was a total made-up tape. So NBC contacted the sheikh directly in Saudi Arabia, who admitted on the phone that he actually made the tape himself. So the reality is, you can see this over and over again where the Saudi officials deny any support for extremism, any anti-Semitism, anti-Christian dogma. This year, there have been dozens of Christians arrested, dozens of them arrested for practicing Christianity. If you ask the Saudi government, are you persecuting Christians? They say, no, there's total freedom. These are lies. And the fact is, unless we're willing to call them on the carpet, then we can pretend that there's no disagreement. We'll all get along. I call it the kumbaya culture. Everyone will have a nice day, and we'll go along with our business, but then business will continue as usual. That's the problem.
Thank you, Senator Schumer. Senator Brownback.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate my colleague, Senator Schumer, I worked with on this issue of the Saudi Arabia for some period of time, and he's been a very effective advocate and good advocate. I've got a pointed question that I wondered how the Saudis recently reacted officially when the Iranian president called for the state of Israel to be wiped off the face of the earth or of the map. What was the official Saudi response? Or did they condemn this statement by the president of Iran?
I don't believe they could. I don't believe they condemned it directly. I believe what they did was to, again, call for a peace settlement between the Arabs and Israel. I don't think you're going to see direct confrontation in the Gulf region, Senator, if people can avoid it. There was a problem in terms of their contact with Iranians.
Didn't the Egyptians condemn that statement?
They are safely, shall we say, distant.
Well, I doubt the Egyptians would agree with that assessment. I mean, it seems like this is a tangible one that you could have, this pretty easy call, pretty direct call on it. You could have said, well, this is an inappropriate statement for any leader to call for another country to be wiped off the map. No official statement out of the Saudis.
Frankly, Senator, I don't know what their official statements have been on this. I do know that they reacted, and it was not in a positive way. But I think you have to understand just how tense things in the Gulf are right now. And this is a matter of countries having to deal with an extraordinarily unstable neighbor undergoing major political change, where at this point in time they don't even know what nature of regime they're dealing with.
Ms. Shea?
Yeah, Senator, in our publications and textbooks, we've seen that kind of sentiment expressed over and over again. And, for example, a fourth grade Saudi state textbook, and again, this is not a cleric or a sect somewhere, this is the government. Own publications, they talk about Israel as being a thorn in the back of the Muslim nations and a window through which colonialism can sneak up among the ranks of the Muslims to work on dividing them and light the fire of hatred between them. The Muslims will not rest until they cut off this disease and purify the land of Palestine from the plague of Zionism and its rightful owners reclaim it, and it's so on and so on.
That's a fourth grade text?
That's a fourth grade textbook that we found in New Jersey from Saudi Arabia. And we have a number of other examples as well. So it's the same kind of sentiment. These are still in circulation. The government claims...
Do you know if, Ms. Shea, do you know if those statements have been repudiated by the Saudi government at any point in time in recent history?
I don't know that.
So actually it would be a consistent statement of what the President of Iran stated for what has been in the textbook sponsored by the Saudi government?
That's correct. And, they say that they're going to, or that they already have, changed the textbooks. I met with the textbook re-education reformers in Saudi Arabia. They came here last December, and they said that actually reform wasn't even necessary. It was all a misunderstanding. After our report came out, our study, the government, the Crown Prince at that time, appointed a new Minister of Education. The only problem is he appointed Mr. Obeid, who had been the Secretary General of the Muslim World League, which the Treasury Department says is an agency of grave concern for its links to extremism. The Gulf Institute, which is an NGO based here in Washington, started by Saudi dissidents, have the new curriculum that's being used inside Saudi Arabia for 05-06, K through 12, and they say it's really just as bad. They're going to be coming out with a new report soon as they get it all translated.
Just, and I will stay within my time, it seems to me basically your best appraisal of a group or entity or even an individual is its fruit, what it produces, what comes out of that, and it seems like we've seen a lot of bad fruit here, and then when you get this particular type of statement that was made by the President of Iran that I think most of the world gasped when he said something like this, and then you look at a regime that doesn't repudiate it. Not only that, apparently its textbooks actually teaches it to its children. This is just, this is not a good fruit situation. I appreciate, Mr. Kordsman, what you're representing. I've worked with the Saudis over the years. I've chaired that subcommittee in the Foreign Relations Committee. I've traveled the region I've also traveled and seen their product in the region. In that region, and particularly in Central Asia, was an area I noted the most. It was an area of change and foment. I traveled it in the late 1990s. And there were two countries that were funding the most disruptive type of behavior in the Stans region, and they were Iran and Saudi Arabia. Virtually every place you would go, there would be some funded group by the Saudis or the Iranians that were pushing very troubling, difficult messages in a region that was fomenting. It just seems like that what we've seen taking place lately is some movement away from that, or maybe some movement towards more subtlety. But I haven't detected yet that the central message has changed at all. Maybe more subtle, but it hasn't changed the message. Chairman, thank you for the panel.
Thank you, Senator Brownback. I'm going to ask unanimous consent to make a part of the record an article written by Mr. Daniel Pipes and published in the New York Sun on March 29th of this year, which contains a number of statements which bear on what we're looking at, and we're going to verify the accuracy of them. But it's represented that the Council on American Islamic Relations published, the Freedom House published information on the Council on American Islamic Relations, which contain repeated references to anti-Semitism and neo-Nazi philosophy. And at the head of the Canadian Islamic Congress, Mohammed El-Masdi publicly endorsed the murder of all Israelis over the age of 18. And that in New York City, an investigation by the New York Daily News in 2003 found that books used in the city's Muslim schools were, quote, rife with inaccuracy and sweeping condemnations of Jews and Christian and triumphant declarations of Islam's supremacy, close quote. And that in Los Angeles, the Omar Ibn Khattab Foundation donated 300 Qurans titled The Meaning of the Holy Quran to the city's school districts in 2001 that had to be pulled from the libraries because of anti-Semitic condemnations. We have had the representations by Mr. Al-Jabeer that the textbooks have been modified. And it is a question which we are going to continue to pursue, Professor Gortzman, to see what the current status is. The legislation on the Saudi Accountability Act calls for Saudi Arabia to vastly improve cooperation with the United States in the investigation of terrorist networks and closing all organizations which fund, train, and incite terror and block all funding from private Saudi citizens and entities to Saudi-based offshore terrorist organizations, and to deal with the issue of the propaganda in the school books. So we are going to be pursuing the subject. Mr. Emerson, I'm advised that you have some information as to what King Abdullah had to say about those who were behind the 2003 attacks on Riyadh in Saudi Arabia.
Yes, Senator. I'll refer to it in a second here. I just wanted to parenthetically make a comment to let you know that sitting behind me is a very prominent and courageous Muslim religious leader, Sheikh Ahmed Subi Mansour, who has prepared testimony that I'd like to ask to be submitted for the record, and who has been a graduate of Al-Azhar University. He is now living in the United States, having been political asylum here, but he is very familiar with and an expert on Wahhabist ideological views, as well as the consistency of the Saudi government in continuing to promote it in publications and online. And I urge him to be used as a resource by this committee.
We'd be pleased to receive that testimony, and it will be made a part of our record.
Right. And in response, in 2004, after there was an attack in the city of Yanbu, Crown Prince Abdullah asserted that, quote, Zionist elements, quote, it has become clear now that Zionism is behind the terrorism actions in the kingdom. I can say that I am 95% sure of that. And then followed up by that was Saudi Foreign Minister Saad al-Faisal, who said that the al-Qaeda attacks were financed by Israel. And that was followed up on a CNN interview when Adel al-Jubeir was interviewed by CNN anchor Wolf Blitzer and asked him about the allegations that there was a secret Zionist plot behind supporting al-Qaeda attacks against the regime. I've included the entire transcript of the exchange between the CNN anchor as well as Mr. al-Jubeir because it's exceptionally instructive, because al-Jubeir consistently tries to equate Israel with al-Qaeda and is given an opportunity finally at the very end to recant and disavow those comments and never once takes the opportunity to do so.
Professor Quartersman, would you care to comment on that?
All I can say, Senator, is that in working with people in Saudi Arabia, in the Ministry of Defense, in the Ministry of Interior, people in the Foreign Ministry, because we just completed a study on Saudi security, I never once had anybody suggest for a moment that there was any Zionist support for al-Qaeda. I've never heard that talking to Prince Turki in conversations that go back 7 years. I've never heard it in talking to the Deputy Minister of Defense in Saudi Arabia or to the sons of the Minister of the Interior. It has always been seen, and they have focused on, what I think they frankly recognize is not only an internal problem, but one which surrounds them from the region. And whatever has been said here is not something that has been raised with me, nor is it typical of any of the people that I have been dealing with who are involved in counterterrorism operations in the country.
Well, Professor Quartersman, I can easily understand why it wouldn't be raised with you. On the conversations that I've had with the Saudi officials when I talked to King Abdullah about Khobar Towers, no bellicose inflammatory statements were made. And in talking to the Saudi ambassador to the United States recently, called me and wanted to be available to answer any questions, and we do have a substantial number of questions for him. No statements like that are made, but when you have the repetition of comments by ranking Saudi officials, including King Abdullah, about the Zionists being behind al-Qaeda, it is antagonistic, inciting propaganda at the highest levels. Can't be denied.
Senator, may I make a brief response?
Sure.
I think what bothers me a little about this is the same King Abdullah, which, as Crown Prince, took with considerable courage the initiative of creating a new peace initiative, and not simply cosmetically, but pushed it through the Arab League. It is the same Saudi Arabia which is put together what will be a conference in December of this year in Mecca of the OIC, a summit meeting, which will be trying to deal with these issues of extremism and terrorism. I can't say that there are not, within Saudi Arabia, many things I don't like. That is something that I have lived with in all my visits to the kingdom. But I hear perhaps a lack of balance that frankly is not necessarily going to help us in persuading them to change.
Well, Professor Quartersman, shouldn't we, while trying to maintain a positive relationship with Saudi Arabia, identify to them in a very direct way the things that you characterize you don't like? Shouldn't we confront the king with the statement, which I think is on the record and not denied, about his being 95% sure that Zionists were behind the al-Qaeda attacks? Should we ignore those matters, or should we deal with them in a very direct way?
I don't think we should ignore them at all, Senator. I have great reservations about legislation. I have no reservations about the Congress putting constant pressure on the administration and the Saudis to respond. My fear with legislation is that often what it happens is it is seen as counterproductive inside the kingdom, where the threat of legislation is not. I think you have tools that you also could use. One of them is to expand the role of the Human Rights Report and require that it deal with reporting in these areas. It is to expand the State Department report on terrorism. The advantage of these kinds of forums is they cover all countries. And I do not believe that Saudi Arabia should be exempted from any of this kind of review. I think that there is a very real reason to have much stronger embassy teams and to have the Congress put much more pressure to get people into embassies like Saudi Arabia who actually work in the field to deal with the countries involved. And I could give you a list of other measures as I have in the testimony. So in no sense am I saying that you should not put pressure here. I think it is vital here, and it is vital in all of the countries where terrorism and extremism are a problem.
Well, I'm pleased to hear you say that it's an appropriate area for Congress to apply pressure, and that you think the introduction of the legislation is appropriate pressure. You just stop a little short of enacting the legislation. When the Syrian Accountability Act was started, it was a pressure point, but as evidence mounted as to what Syria was doing, and the evidence has continued to mount, that legislation was finally enacted. And the administration took the position you do: don't legislate, don't tie the hands of the administration. But finally, at the very end, the Bush administration agreed with the Syrian Accountability Act. And these are not easy matters. There is great concern that if Bashar Assad falls, that there will be a replacement causing more problems for the United States. And I think we have to continue to work with the Syrian government, notwithstanding all of the problems that they've presented, especially on being transit points for insurgents going into Iraq. But while we continue to work with them, let's not be bashful about confronting them. I don't think we're too far apart on that point. And we're going to have very substantial additional questions for the Saudi government. I will take up the Saudi foreign minister on his invitation to respond to questions. We'll have more questions for him than we had for the entire panel. Ms. Shea, did you have something more you wanted to say? You were looking for some responses to my question earlier. If you want to add something, we'd be pleased to hear it now.
Okay, well, we have one of the books, the anti-Semitic passage, in one of the books we found here, issued by the Saudi government, Ministry of Education, Riyadh. The Jews lured women to go to work in the factories, and when the number of working women increased, they lured them into wearing makeup and revealing clothes to corrupt their morals and to corrupt young men with them. So that is the tenor of this stuff. It's not against the policies of Israel. It's not on a political level. It's just truly anti-Semitic and awful. And Mr. Chairman, also I'd like to point out that the GAO issued a very important study at the request of some of the members of the Senate. And they released it in September, and in it they found as of July 2005, agency officials, meaning across interagency officials, whether it's state or treasury, did not know if the government of Saudi Arabia had taken steps to ensure that Saudi-funded curricula or religious activities in other countries do not propagate extremism. And I think that's a very important point, and I share Mr. Kortzman's view that this should be reported on in the religion reports and the human rights reports, and that the U.S. government should press Saudi Arabia for an accounting, and I think that you should include it in your act as well. Thank you.
Mr. Bakalai, would you care to add anything at this point?
No, Senator, we just wanted to differentiate the fact that the indoctrination by Saudi be one thing, we're not here to comment on it, but the fact that the assumption and extrapolation of a report implying that that could be invaded or filled, that's the point we were trying to make, that the indoctrination by Saudi of these few books or whatever is not necessarily a true picture of the American Muslim, which you have alluded already. So,
Well, we want to be emphatic that there's no condemnation or criticism of the Muslim community in the United States. We welcome your participation in our country, as we welcome men and women of all faiths or those who choose to abstain. Well, thank you all very much for coming. This is, I think, a constructive hearing, and one which will be ongoing and one which we will pursue. That concludes our hearing.
thank you.
In a moment, we'll hear from the Saudi ambassador to the U.S. on anti-terrorism efforts. Then, the French Prime Minister talks about his country's response to widespread rioting, followed by another look at this hearing on Saudi Arabia's role in fighting terrorism.